Good afternoon, and welcome for joining us today for our presentation. My name is Ina Mesa-Emo, and I am Program Associate here at the Center for Global Policy Solutions. Thank you for wanting to learn more about financial inclusion protection. Our presentation today is A Seat at the Table: The Importance of Financial Inclusion and Protection for Communities of Color. We are hosted by the Closing the Racial Wealth Gap Initiative, which is a national collaboration between the Center for Global Policy Solutions here in Washington, D.C., and the Insight Center for Community Economic Development in Oakland, California. The goal of our initiative is to build awareness and support for efforts to address the structural factors that contribute to racial and ethnic wealth disparities or inequities. So why this webinar? Why is this webinar relevant and important for us today? Well, there are several financial devices that have been embedded into the United States banking system in recent years that allow American families to save and build wealth through affordable and convenient means, including automatic transfer, direct deposit, and mobile banking. Unfortunately, many households of color are not benefiting from these advancements. They are either not participating or they are partially participating in the financial mainstream. Households such as these are referred to as underbanked or unbanked. Underbanked meaning that the household either owns a checking or savings account but relies on alternative financial services such as payday lenders or check cashing services, or unbanked, meaning that the household does not own a bank account at all. According to the 2011 National FDIC survey on unbanked and underbanked households, these households were most prevalent among non-Asian minorities. For example, according to the survey, Black households, Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, Hispanics, and American Indians have the highest proportions of underbanked households compared to whites. Underbanked households, as well, are disproportionately represented among foreign-born non-citizens at 22.2%, and households where Spanish is the only language is also disproportionately represented. But what does this mean? This means that these households that rely on these alternative financial service providers, such as payday lenders or check cash services, receive high cost and interest rates that severely hurt their economic stability and mobility. And in a nation of swiftly changing demographics, it is very important for policymakers to understand how and why these households of color have such high rates of non-participation. And in addition, legislators must create lasting policies that both encourage and protect a banking environment of inclusion and diversity. Which brings us to our agenda. The goals for this webinar today is to discuss the history of the racial and ethnic financial inclusion issues, as well as current barriers facing these households, the need for inclusion within the financial services industry, as well as highlighting a new report from the NDoubleACP that goes into great detail about this issue, discussing inclusive solutions on the federal level, as well as innovative strategies that nonprofits and local communities are implementing to address this problem. This brings us to today's speakers. We have a wonderful panel of experts who can provide us a background to these issues. We have Marissa Bell, Policy Analyst with the Wealth Building Policy Project at the National Council of La Raza. We have Dietrich Muhammad, who is Senior Director of the Economic Department and Executive Director of the Financial Freedom Center at the NAACP, as well as Melanie Kwan, Innovation Strategist for the Doorways to Dreams Fund, also known as D2D Fund. And we'll be starting with Marissa Bell. Marissa Bell works as Policy Analyst for the National Council of La Raza, the largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States. She produces policy documents that demonstrate the effects of social programs on the Latino community and communicates NCLR's position and recommends policy changes to Congress and NCLR's affiliate organizations. Her portfolio includes banking and homeownership policies affecting Latino families and immigrant access to financial services. In 2012, she led NCLR's statewide research project in California that assessed Latino engagement in the financial mainstream system. And with that, I will turn it over to Marissa Bell.
Hi, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And thanks everyone for joining us on this webinar today to discuss these issues that are obviously very important to the communities that we serve, the panelists here on the webinar today, but hopefully as we engage communities and all the work that you do in the audience, that you'll be able to get some helpful information from us today. So again, just a little bit of background on NCLR. We are a Hispanic serving organization, and we work to improve opportunities for Hispanics in the U.S. In the Wealth Building Policy Project, we're really focused on strengthening the Latino community by preserving and increasing the wealth and assets that the community has access to. And we really work to narrow the racial wealth gap through policies and programs that are addressing the structural and economic barriers, some of which we'll be covering today. So when we talk about the racial wealth gap, I just wanted to point out, even though today we'll be focusing on the financial system and structural barriers within this system that have led to a very disparate treatment of communities of color and low-income communities, that there's actually a number of factors we're looking at here. And this is actually information from Brandeis University, from their policy school, that really looks at historical inequities in household wealth. And so these are some of the factors that they identified that, again, we're not going to get into too much today, but I just wanted to put this up for reference. Again, this is actually based on a study looking at families over a span of 25 years, the same families from African American and white communities, and really was able to identify factors that, again, led to inequities in wealth for households. And it's a great piece of research that I encourage people to look at. And I see that I failed to put the link up there, but if you email me, I can give it to you if you haven't seen it before. But again, looking at the financial system, really what we're looking at here is a great structural problem that has been addressed over many years, and still, unfortunately, we see a lot of lingering results from historical practices. So I guess the biggest issue here when we're looking at the financial industry and inequities among communities of color, the practice of redlining that I'm sure many of you on the phone on this webinar have heard of or are familiar with, but really was just used very explicitly to look at race and ethnicity to determine eligibility of mortgages for communities which perpetuated housing segregation. But not only just housing, financial services were denied or limited to certain neighborhoods, again, just based strictly on racial or ethnic composition without looking at all regard to the residents' qualifications or their creditworthiness. So Congress has tried to address this issue with the Fair Housing Act, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, and then in 1977 we had the Community Reinvestment Act, really trying to reduce discriminatory credit practices against low-income neighborhoods. But as we all know, structural flaws in the financial market have really continued to result in the unequal access to financial products that have been key to the economic success and, unfortunately, to the proliferation of deceptive practices. So as a result of this, minority communities have routinely paid more for credit, which has often been accompanied by riskier terms. So even though there was the necessary authority in place and we had laws like the ones I referenced, the Community Reinvestment Act, the CRA, has been a great tool, we still see that regulators really failed to rein in some of the worst practices or to really advance policy that could have helped communities of color and families to build financial security. So this lack of oversight is what I'm going to point to as really being key into why we have this financial exclusion within certain racial and ethnic communities. And it really helped to pave the way for many troubling practices that we are still struggling with today. So the points that I've put up here today are really just a couple that we've identified as having worked against communities of color. So the first one is really just talking about often short-term profits really were prioritized over longer-term gains. And so what I mean here is that, sorry? Okay. So just for instance, Hispanic borrowers tend to have a thin credit profile. So that's considered a unique profile, and creditors often consider that hard to serve. But in the market, there really are sound underwriting models and products that can actually serve someone with this kind of characteristic profile. But there has been little incentive to sell in the marketplace because they're not huge profit earners. So subprime models for credit, on the other hand, have been seen to be profitable because you can attach really high interest rates to that and high fees. So even though there are sound models that are prime, that would be helpful to people with, for instance, again, a thin credit file being this example, the price that Wall Street basically was willing to pay for that for a riskier one was more profitable. So, low-risk prime credit was really restricted to a lot of people who happen to be minority and communities of color. So as a result of this practice, we know that a lot of minorities have actually paid more for things like credit in most market segments. So that means that they're more likely to receive high-cost mortgages. They're more likely than white families to have credit card interest rates that are just enormously high. And they're also more likely to be charged markups, for instance, on their auto loans. At the same time, we know that disparate impact trends and practices were not being properly identified or investigated, and they were not acted upon. So even though there was evidence that minority borrowers have paid more for credit and were steered, they actually were led to subprime credit, even though they might have qualified for a better product. These trends in large part were going unnoticed by the federal regulators who could have acted. So people claim that there wasn't enough data, in order to take real enforcement action against, the worst actors. They really didn't exercise the authority that they had. Again, going back to those laws that I mentioned a little bit earlier, that we did have things in place that could have helped, but the regulators really just were not interested in further investigating. And so at the same time, unfortunately, while there's a vacuum of good quality products in some minority communities, we know that alternative financial services like payday lenders or the buy here, pay here auto dealers and many other fringe financial providers tend to cluster in these minority communities. So, redlining was supposed to, or the acts of Congress against redlining were supposed to ensure that that there were prime financial mainstream institutions and services available to these communities, but that wasn't necessarily the case. And in their absence, a lot of these fringe services were able to really thrive. So I would say the third point that we've identified as being a huge issue in this disparate impact here is that shopping for credit was almost impossible. And what I mean by that is that there was really a growing complexity of the products, and consumers really oftentimes lacked the necessary information that they needed in order to make a sound financial decision. So credit cards, auto loans, and mortgage offers have historically not been very transparent. We all are familiar with, with the disclosure fees, and agreements that are very technical and tend to be very long. It's very hard for someone at the point of purchase, maybe, or when they need to make a decision about, what kind of credit it is that they need. If they don't have enough information, obviously very hard to make the decision at the time that they need it. And so as a result, a lot of borrowers will often forego shopping for credit altogether. And if something is sort of in front of them a little bit easier, it might be costlier, but it's easier to handle than a more complicated product. So that has also led to, obviously, large problems in the credit market. So I would say that this all just points to a lack of regulatory oversight that has really led to some serious consequences, not only just for families, but playing out at the local and national economies. And so the recession really was driven by not only this predatory lending, but we saw high rates of unemployment, and it sort of helped to create a perfect storm for the economic recession and the crisis, that many would argue we're still really trying to come out of. So what I just want to point to here is this data is looking at pre-recession and post-recession data. This is from the Pew Research Center. I'm sure a lot of people on the phone are familiar with this research, but what it's looking at is the assets that families had in select demographic categories and the effect that post-recession, what that had on their median net worth of these households. So obviously, and excluding the Asian group just for a minute, when we look at Latino and Africans compared to whites, obviously a very drastic drop in household wealth there. And again, looking at the timeline, 2005 to 2009, this is really due in large part because the housing crisis happened, and for so many of these families, their only asset, so not only the largest asset, but a lot of times the only asset they had was their home. So the foreclosure crisis obviously hit these communities the hardest. And as a result, families lost a great deal of their wealth. And then again, looking at the Asian data here, they actually started out from a higher point than the white counterparts in this data, and then again post-recession fell by a great amount. And then again, this is from Pew's research, and they do note that for the Asian data, it's very similar to Hispanics. The geographical concentration of a lot of Asians was in places such as California, where the foreclosure crisis did hit very hard. And so the market meltdown, again, the loss of an asset such as a home, really helped to contribute to that. But at the same time, this data also includes the arrival of new Asian immigrants from about 2004, so right before this data was collected, who tended to have less assets than some of the Asian population that was also included in this. So they've had less time in the country and actually had less assets, which helped to account for some of the decline here. But I know that when this data is also collected, sometimes it's very hard to take out some of the subgroup data, which tells kind of a different story and adds a little bit of texture to the story as well. So this is Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders on top, and you can see that it's a slightly different time frame. But the poverty rate within the Asian American and Pacific Islander community has actually increased much more than the average U.S. poverty has. So so that the data isn't totally skewed by just looking at median household wealth, we can see within the subgroups of Asian communities there actually has been also a large increase in the amount of people who are in poverty. And so we touched upon a little bit earlier with some of the information about banking, but so we know that families are in great need for great financial products and financial services that will really help them to get on their feet. We know that families have drained their savings, debt has increased, and so the racial wealth gap, actually is not lessening, it's widening. And so families really need, some of the really basic fundamental tools to help get them back on their feet, to increase their economic stability, and to help rebuild those tangible assets, and repair credit. But at the same time, we know that so many people have actually fallen out of the banking system. And again, to some of the points that were mentioned a little bit earlier, we do know that there are certain demographic characteristics and that sort of help to point to who tends to be outside of the banking system, which does include non-citizens, people who are unemployed, again, those non-Asian minorities. And then this is just another table that looks at some of that. But I will point out that for foreign-born non-U.S. citizens, they do tend to be more unbanked, so completely out of the banking system. But then when we look at data for African Americans, they are in the banking system, more likely to be in the banking system, but not actually using some of those mainstream tools that they might have access to, which then puts them as a higher incidence of being underbanked. And so again, this data is from the FDIC's most recent national survey of households. So again, families who are outside of the banking system are usually being driven to the alternative financial services and products that tend to, again, be clustered in low-income and minority communities. But the research that NCLR has done really shows that individuals are choosing these products because they really are meeting a need that they're not finding in mainstream financial institutions. And so these are some of the factors that we found that help sort of determine when families and individuals go to these financial services and products. These are sort of the different things that they're evaluating. So is it the convenience because geographically it's closer to someone's house or to someone's job? Is it a language access issue? Is it because maybe the cost associated with a bank account, a lot of people have a perception that they don't actually make enough money to need a bank account or to be able to maintain one. It could be that someone's been gotten caught in the hidden fees associated, or what they refer to as hidden fees because they didn't know explicitly there might be an overdraft fee, or you might have to maintain a minimum balance. Again, for our non-U.S. citizens who are very much more likely to be outside of the banking system, is it because they don't have a Social Security card and don't know that some banks do actually allow you to open an account with an ITIN or individual taxpayer identification number, that you don't have to have a Social Security number to open it. So a lot of these factors really play into what is driving people to using these alternative services. So they're meeting a need, but we know that it's really not helping to set people up for the longer-term financial stability or to help increase their financial capability over the long term, which they actually can get from using a mainstream financial system. So that is why we need to help engage them into the mainstream. And so these are some recommendations that we've come up with based on our research. Obviously, for non-citizens, there's sort of special needs that should be addressed, and we can actually use getting them into the mainstream system sort of as at the same time as naturalization to really help connect them to some of these good tools that are out there. We also know that we think that savings is a huge issue for people. Obviously, we know that savings were devastated most recently, so it's really important to help people have that reserve and to help incentivize that. We know that people have a need for small dollar credit, which is why they go to places like payday lenders. And so we really would like to see the mainstream financial system come up with some solutions that are safer and, again, that help put people on that longer-term financial path to financial stability. And that, maybe you get a foot in the door with a small dollar loan from a prime financial institution, and then that helps build your credit score, and then, you're able to graduate to better products too. And then we know that there is a big move towards, mobile technology or online platforms, but we want to make sure that that actually is a really good access point for people and not, inadvertently leaving more people out of the banking system. So for people who maybe don't have a lot of access to this technology, we want to make sure that this isn't a way of keeping them out. So bridging that divide, and helping to meet people where they are. And also not taking advantage of the fact that people might have more engagement as they're young, but we want the financial industry to be able to meet people where they are. So your financial needs will obviously change over your lifetime. So we want to make sure that there's engagement at all the different points when people might need a different product or might need a different financial solution for forever where they are in their lifetime. And last but not least, obviously so many of these issues really came to, brought to light a lot of the lack of financial regulatory oversight that went on. And so for many, many years, we were without sort of what we call a consumer watchdog. And luckily we did have the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So we think that keeping it strong and, helping support the protections that it has will really, in the long term, just be super beneficial to consumers. They've already had some really great legislative victories. So, we just want to make sure that the CFPB stays strong. And I went through some of these a little bit quickly. There's a lot of information. So if anyone has any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me after the webinar. So Mel, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of information. If anyone has any questions, feel free to use the chat feature to submit your questions. We'll be collecting the questions as we go, but we'll be addressing them at the end of our panel. Moving right along to Dietrich Muhammad, Senior Director of the Economic Department and Executive Director of the Financial Freedom Center at the NAACP. In 2011, the NAACP relaunched its economic department with a new headquarters here in Washington, D.C. To focus on financial and economic education, fair lending, and diversity and inclusion efforts. Dietrich's previous experience includes his time at the Reverend Al Sharpton's National Action Network, where he first worked as the National Crisis Coordinator, then as the National Field Director at United for a Fair Economy, where he was coordinator of the Racial Wealth Divide Project, and he co-founded the State of the Dream Report and has co-authored 5 of its annual reports. He also has worked at the Institute for Policy Studies, IPS, where he worked in the Inequality and Common Good program under the leadership of Chuck Collins. At IPS, he co-founded the Race and Economy Forum with the Economic Policy Institute's Algernon Austin, and during this time he produced the reports 40 years later, The Unrealized American Dream, and the report Challenges to Native American Advancement, The Recession in Native America. And with that, I'll turn it over to him.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Just want to make sure. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for coming on. Again, this is a very important subject. I'm glad there's more and more attention to economic inequality and increasingly racial economic inequality. And as a small part of the work of the NAACP, and if you want to know what type of work the NAACP is doing around economics, please go to our website, NDoubleACP.org, and you can specifically go to NAACP.org/econ. And that'll get you to the economic department's subpage. So we're talking about, like I said, one small part of our work, the Opportunity Diversity Report Card. We have relaunched these report cards. This is our second report card in the last couple years. The first one was on the hotel industry, and this one is on the banking industry. And we feel the importance of doing something on the banking industry, as our last speaker was highlighting, is the banking industry is so important as it relates to wealth development. And so we do believe greater diversity in the banking sector might have a positive effect as it relates to asset development, asset management in minority, particularly African American community. But then also, too, we see that it's very important just in terms of jobs in its own right, that we make sure this large part of the economy is inclusive as it relates to workforce and other areas. So I will go to slide 2, which again just shows the cover of our report card. Again, one thing we try to put forward is that the United States will be majority minority by 2043. So when you talk about racial economic inequality in the past, you can talk about it as looking at, well, look how this small group of Americans aren't doing as well as the rest of Americans, and more for moral reasons we should do something about it. But increasingly, it's true that if the majority, as African Americans and Latinos become increasingly large segments of the American population, and the American population as a whole becomes majority minority, if there are still racial economic inequality in 2043, you are now talking about the majority of Americans and really threatening the American middle class and the historic American middle class economy, which this country has been based upon. So again, on this slide, it highlights that by 2020, there will have been 1 million jobs added to the financial sector since 2010. These jobs will be overwhelmingly paid living wages, and the sector has a poor record of diversity. So again, we think focusing in on this industry that is a growth industry and that, unlike many other growth industries, are actually overwhelmingly pays living wage jobs, it's important to make sure that diversity and inclusion is a part of the future of this industry. For the next slide, slide 3, again, you look at workforce diversity, and you generally get, and again, this is just a brief review of the findings of this report, that, as is so often the case, that the higher level the positions, the least likely there is to be a strong diversity. So about the fifth kind of point down, where it says between 1993 and 2011, African American employment in financial management positions increased 0.7%. We are seeing very limited increases in diversity, even as the workforce becomes more diversity, and even as time goes by, where you would think that past efforts should be paying greater rewards. If we go to the next slide, this slide talks about over 25-year-olds with college degrees by race and ethnicity. And the point of this slide is just to highlight that people of color are increasing their college attainment at rates faster than white Americans. And let's just go to the next slide. But this next slide is highlighting that, in fact, even though there is greater educational attainment among particularly African Americans and Latinos, we're not seeing much change in the representation of African Americans and Latinos as it relates to management in the financial sector. This slide is a little confusing, but if you look at the kind of up and down bars, that is highlighting, again, the amount of African Americans and Hispanics with college degrees, and you see a steady increase from 93 to 2011, 2012. For African Americans, it's increased from 12% college degrees to 21% college degrees. And from Latinos, you see also a strong increase from around 10% to about 14%. But if you look at the percentage of African Americans and Latinos in management, you see that it moves very little, oftentimes less than a percentage point. And so we are at a place where there is still such a low representation of African Americans and Latinos in financial management. If we go to the next slide, we talk about supplier diversity. So much of the report card is talking about the workforce diversity, but the banking sector also spends billions upon billions of dollars with businesses for contracting services. And sadly, this is one of the areas where the banking industry has scored the worst. we found that banks continue to struggle with diversification in their supplier purchasing, with 1.6% of the supplier budget being the most any bank spent on African American suppliers, and 5.3% being the most any bank spent on firms owned by people of color. So, we constantly hear about how small business is a great creator of jobs, is the future of economic empowerment. But if a major industry like the banking industry is only spending less than 2% of their supplier dollars with black businesses, and about 5% of their supplier dollars with people of color, who represent over 30% of the population, we see that there is a serious lack of investment in African American and people of color owned businesses. If you go to the next slide, this just highlights, and it's probably too detailed for most people to care that much about, but it just highlights what percentage you would need to get a certain grade. So for a governing body, you see where it says AA. If you have 13% of your governing body, usually board of directors or higher, you would get an A. If you had 10% of your governing body or higher, or up to 13%, you'd have a B, and so on. One thing you'll note is that we did do a sliding measurement. You'll see that for top management, you only required an 8% African Americans in top management to get an A, because we did try to recognize the challenges that the banking industry has found in diversity. And so we wanted to recognize if all the banks are having a very hard time with getting people of color in, very hard time getting people of color into these places, then we would make the standard lower to recognize that. But even with a weighted grade, we found too many of the major banks received very low grades. So let's go to the next slide, where we talk about small dollar loans. So this report card covered workforce diversity, covered supplier diversity, and now we're talking about small dollar loans. And again, as our last caller was talking about, there is great concern about how much money is lost in people of color communities from predatory lending, particularly payday lending, high cost small dollar loans. So one thing we are pushing the major banking institutions to do is to push them to develop more small dollar lending products with low cost interest rates. And we see that there's actually that none of the banks reach our standard in terms of overdraft fees, about how much they cost for overdraft fees. We considered all of the banks' overdraft fee level as of 2011 as high-cost loans, and so that's something all the banks needed to work on. And then you see where it says small dollar loans, that we found some banks, like Bank of America, was not offering any small dollar loans. Other banks, like Citibank, was putting forward small dollar loans that we considered responsible, meaning they had a 36% interest rate or less, which we believe anything above 36% interest rate is high cost. And then some of the other banks, like J.P. Morgan Chase and U.S. Bank, had a mixture of some high cost loans and responsible loans. And then we also graded, as you'll note, how much money are they investing in payday lenders. And the more money you invested in payday lenders, the worse your grade. So, and we did that as a percentage of their overall assets. So we gave Wells Fargo the lowest grade for having too much money invested in payday lenders, and Citibank the highest grade for having such little money invested in payday lenders. If we can go to the next slide. In our report card, NDoubleACP report card, we broke out African American community, how well banks are doing in terms of diversity as it relates to the African American community, and then we did it for people of color as a whole, which still included African Americans, because obviously African Americans are part of people of color, but we wanted to make sure that we pulled out African Americans to see specifically how well we're doing there, but also how well banks are doing with people of color as a whole. And there's a lot of similarities, and in general, again, we find that the lowest grades for the banking institutions happened around top management. As you see, for African Americans, the highest grade was a C, with most banks getting a D or F as it relates to top management in terms of African American inclusion. And then you see as well in terms of supplier diversity, no one got a passing grade as it related to African American supplier diversity. If we go to the next slide, where it says people of color in small dollar loans, you will see that this gives the grades of how banks did as related to people of color as a whole. And again, you'll see as it relates to top management, Citibank had the highest grade for people of color inclusion with a C. But again, in supplier diversity, as it relates to people of color, all banks received a D or an F. And let's go. We just have a couple more slides just to kind of review what we've gone over. That diversification, the general findings are diversification of the workforce and supplier networks of the financial industry has not kept up with increasing education and workforce of qualified people of color. And that there is, I'm skipping a sentence, but there is a blueprint for diversifying financial services workforces based on the success of the existing federal financial workforce. We did find that Dodd-Frank is requiring that financial firms begin self-assessments of their diversity, and we are in conversations with some of these federal agencies and with the banks themselves about they have seen the NDoubleACP report card on diversity, and how can we help them as they're getting ready to do a self-assessment of their diversity for federal agencies. And then on the next slide where it says NDoubleACP Recommendations, we'll just highlight some of the basic suggestions we have for the industry as a whole. We have more specific recommendations for each banking industry, which we are in communication with them about. Is that the NAACP recommends an adoption of the RLJ rule proposed by Robert L. Johnson to expand upper management and supplier diversity in the financial industry. And that rule is to make sure that for any upper management and supplier diversity opportunities, that at least 2 people of color be candidates in that pool, and that the pool is considered unacceptable without that representation. NAACP also recommends that banks add flexibility to the procurement system. Oftentimes, banks will say that, look, the problem we have with supplier diversity is that many of the people of color or African American owned businesses are too small and can't handle kind of the national services we need. So we are asking them to break up their contracts, do more with subcontracting to ensure that for the work they need by smaller businesses, African American and people of color businesses are included. And finally, we ask that the NAACP asks that the leading banks develop a goal-based timeline for achieving diversity, and that they produce empirical results indicating increased workforce and supplier diversity. We find in general that what corporations will do is they will present a list of diversity programs they have as evidence of their good work. The list of programs isn't evidence of their good work. What's evidence of their good work is showing how their diversity has increased as it relates to workforce diversity, supplier diversity, or as it relates to lending practices. So we need less a list on programs and more a list on the results of their diversity work. And then the final slide, just to thank you, it gives you my email information, it gives you our website, and I think the best way to stay in touch of the daily work we do is our Financial Freedom Campaign Facebook page you can just find on Facebook. So I thank you, and we'll hand this back over.
Thank you so much, Dietrich. And we just got a really quick question that I think you should address. The report card is on your website, correct?
It is on our website.
Yes.
And if you have any trouble getting that, you can email me, or you can even call our office, 202-478-6400, and we can email that to you. But I believe it's actually on the main web page on kind of the 5 flashing banners, and then if you go to our NAACP.org/econ webpage, there should be a list of resources, a button called Resources, and you can find the report there.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
And finally, we have our final panelist, Melanie Kwan Duke. She is Innovation Strategist at the Doorways for Dreams Fund, where she focuses on efforts on both tax time and Prizelink Savings. Before joining Doorways for Dreams, she spent a year as a fellow with the Financial Clinic in New York, where she leveraged on-the-ground experience providing free financial counseling to inform her work on financial policy and product innovation. Before the fellowship, she worked in Seoul, South Korea, and New York for Standard Chartered Bank, covering international development and microfinance organizations. I will turn it over to Melanie now.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here to talk about some of our work in the field. I work for an organization called the Doremus Fund, and we are a 12-year-old national nonprofit based in Boston that works to strengthen the financial opportunity and security of low and moderate income consumers by innovating, incubating, and stimulating new financial products and policies, and we focus on savings and asset building. Because we are not actually a financial services provider, we collaborate with banks, businesses, credit unions, the government, and other nonprofits to really test product innovations and scale them across the country. So you can think of us as a laboratory for sort of new financial products. So I think a lot of the information on this slide is not going to be news to people on this call, and I think Marissa Bell did a really good job earlier of going through a lot of this data. But so very briefly, we know that wealth and savings matter for mobility. If we care about mobility, we also have to care about savings and building assets. A 2009 Pew report that I'm sure many people on this call are familiar with demonstrated that while moving up the income ladder is fairly limited for children of low-income parents, there is a clear relationship between savings and economic mobility. More specifically, children of high-saving, low-income parents are significantly more likely to be upwardly mobile than children of low-saving, low-income parents. So this is really important and really encouraging, but unfortunately, we also know that Americans do not save very much. So a quarter of Americans have no savings. And low-income households, as Marissa Bell said, saw a significant drop in wealth after the recession, and it was amplified in communities of color. 44% of Americans lack savings to cover basic needs for 3 months, and nearly 2/3 of households of color are liquid asset poor. And research done by ICCED has shown that nearly half of Black and Latino women have zero or negative net worth, and the median net worth of Black and Latino women aged 36 to 49 is $5. So we know that the racial wealth gap far exceeds the racial income gap and that it is only growing. So if it is true that household balance sheets play a key role in mobility and that these balance sheets are, to say the least, very weak for many Americans, we at D2D believe that we need to be trying new and different things to engage consumers, particularly low to moderate income consumers, in saving in order to really break down barriers to access of effective and safe products that foster financial security. So this slide just has a brief overview of our theory of change. So when we think about closing the wealth gap, the things we look for in products that we are innovating and testing are first, engagement. So do people want to be using these products? And we get at this through design. And second, accessibility. So scale. How do we get products to scale? And for us, most of the time that means using and working within the marketplace. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but it just shows our idea creation model, which starts with ideation and then moves towards scale and impact. So today what I want to do is just give you very brief overviews of a few of our project areas and products that showcase how we are working to close the wealth gap and think outside sort of the traditional financial services sector to increase financial security and opportunity. One of our projects is called Prizelink Savings, which asks the very simple question, can saving be fun? So we know that annually there is over $60 billion in lottery sales, and 38% of those with incomes below $25,000 actually think that winning the lottery represents the most practical way for them to accumulate several $100,000. And so Prizelink Savings uses the simple insight that winning is fun and playing games is fun, and we use this and apply it to saving. So in a Prizelink Savings product, every act of depositing is a chance to win prizes. Prizelink Savings bundles savings with entertainment and reframes saving from something that is self-sacrificing and kind of boring into something that is really rewarding. So in 2009, we worked with the Michigan Credit Union League to bring the first large-scale Prizelink Savings product to the United States. The product was a balance-building CD in which every $25 is a chance to win a monthly prize, and at that time, the grand prize was $100,000 at the end of the year. If we fast forward to 2014, Save to Win is available in 4 states. 8 states have passed legislation to allow products, and there are over 42,000 account holders with over $70 million saved to date. And we do research on the product, and we know that the vast majority of account holders are actually financially vulnerable, and up to 50% are actually new to savings. So people have never saved before. Something about this product is really catching their attention, which we're really excited about. So another area we work on is saving at tax time. I'm sure everyone knows tax time is this very huge financial event. Every year, over $115 billion is returned to low to moderate income households, and someone could receive up to 25% of their annual income in one day. So this is what we call a savable moment, but we weren't really seeing any way to really save money directly on the tax form. So lots of people get their returns and they say, well, okay, it'll hit my checking account and then I'll save later. But way back when, DoD thought, well, what if there was a way to really save before that even hits your account? So years of pilot tests with Treasury and free tax preparation sites across the country demonstrated that there actually was a really strong demand among low to moderate income households for this ability to pre-commit to saving a tax return. And then later also for those who didn't have access to maybe very sophisticated savings products, also the option to purchase savings bonds on a return. So the outcome here was first something called Form 8888, which is the form on your taxes that allows you to split your return into multiple accounts. And then in 2009, President Obama instructed Treasury to put the option to purchase savings bonds with your return on the tax form. So since then, over 100,000 tax filers have saved over $60 million in savings bonds for themselves and their loved ones. And over 70% of these have adjusted gross incomes below the national median, and a third are EITC recipients. So this innovation here wasn't really as a product, it was more of a policy. So here's another question we had. How can we improve financial decision making? Or in other words, how can we take a new approach to financial education? So the pictures here, which is more likely to get your attention? Do you want to sit down and read with books, or would you rather play a game? So this led us to our financial entertainment and gamification work. We have built a library of what is called casual games. So games that are aimed at adults that you play, like Angry Birds and Candy Crush, things like that. But these actually teach financial concepts. So they teach things like how to plan for retirement, how to budget, credit, and debt, things like that. And the games are really fun, and it doesn't really feel like you're learning. You just know that you're having fun. And they're also engaging first and really easily scalable. In addition to pedagogy, they actually have the potential to drive real-world action. And again, we use partners like actually NCLR, Staples, banks, and universities to get these out to the public. So we have another area of work that comes out of the insight that mobile does offer a significant opportunity for reaching underserved populations for all of the reasons listed on this slide. So we've been running competitions, public challenges for the past 2 years to source really innovative ideas, designs, and products that foster financial access and capability. We're hoping to cultivate a system of IT developers, financial service firms, investors, and others that are committed to increasing the quantity and quality of fintech innovation. So out of these challenges have come several really great apps that promote financial access and capability that you can actually go and download onto your phone today. So the last thing that I will mention today is our work on prepaid cards, which came out of research really on financial shocks and how crucial preparing for financial emergencies is. So we know that income shocks are inevitable, but the impact on consumers really can vary based on how prepared people are financially. So a medical expense or a broken transmission can be a hiccup, a financial hiccup, or it can be a huge emergency, depending on whether or not you have money saved to deal with unexpected expenses. So there are a lot of different opinions about prepaid cards out there, and I think some people like them and some people don't. But the reality is that many low to moderate income consumers use them and that they are increasing in popularity. So we have done work with a prepaid card company called Banking Up to pilot what it would look like to have a savings pocket on a prepaid card. The results were really amazing. We saw a high take-up rate, over $14 million deposited. And people who use the savings pocket actually reported that they relied less on payday loans and borrowing than other card users who had emergencies. So we found this to be really encouraging, and we're also working now with another prepaid card provider, Advent, to do something similar for tax time. So that's all I have today, and I look forward to answering questions that you have. Feel free to email me if you have any questions about anything that I've said. I'll hand it back. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. So we'll now be taking any questions or comments from participants. Feel free to submit the question via chat. So we had several questions come in regarding the market. I'm trying to see how, I guess I'll start with this question. And I'll give this to the entire group if anyone knows. Can you comment on the recent $13 billion JP Morgan settlement, specifically the $4 billion apparently going to consumers? Who gets it, and how do nonprofits access it? If anyone knows the answer to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to say I don't know the answer. I know my fair lending specialist does know the answer because there are so many settlements that are coming out with the major banks almost monthly, and I just managed to get them confused in my head. But if someone's from a national nonprofit that's interested, again, they could reach me if no one else on the panel knows, and I can get my fair lending specialist I can connect them to my fair lending specialist who can give you that information.
Great, thank you.
And that was Dietrich from NDoubleACP.
Yes. Another question we have is, given the last few years' revelations of predatory nature of so much mainstream banking, should we still be posing, I assume this chatter means posing mainstream banking as a goal versus some other categorization conveying fair and affordable products regardless of if it's within or outside the banks? For example, a 59-cent money order at a check casher versus $2.50 to $5 at a bank. I will give this to Marissa Bell.
Sure.
Or Dietrich?
Hi. Yeah, I can chime in a little bit for this one. So I guess that obviously it's up to a consumer to decide which products are going to best fit their needs. Again, we already know that people are using alternative products because they are meeting a need. Is it convenience, again, location, or just they need the quick access to cash, and that's how they're going to get it. So it's not that we're saying that the banks are going to save everyone or that is the answer for everyone. But if there are alternative solutions out there, we just need to make sure that they are crafted and offered to a consumer in a way that is going to help them, at best achieve their longer-term financial goals, help to increase. By that, what I mean is that, is this just sort of like a one-time transaction, or is it something that can help, again, to build a really strong financial foothold and help to elevate them, along the financial ladder? So it's better credit rates, better loan, better interest rates, when they're seeking other products, and so can it help expand their financial world and what they have access to in a way that is safe, and are there protections in place? So, I guess the answer from my point of view would be that it's not saying that mainstream banks are the answer for everything, but if there are proper protections and proper transparencies in place for the consumer, an alternative product can, maybe be the answer for them. But again, looking at what does that do for their longer term, engagement with the financial services industry.
Yes. Okay, great. Another question we had was, I'll give this one over to Melanie. Is there any special focus on pilots linking alternative providers like check cashers with savings vehicles?
There are. I know that there's a lot of work done in North Carolina, I want to say. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can look it up, and if whoever answered the question can email me. I do know of a few things here and there, just not off the top of my head.
Okay, great. Lots of questions pouring in. I'll try to get to all of them if I can. This question is about credit unions. So I'll give this one to Dietrich. Many community development credit unions have merged, whether by choice or by force with larger mainstream credit unions. But is there any serious effort to hold mainstream credit unions truly accountable versus assuming that all credit unions are aggressively responsive to low-income and minority communities?
That's a good point. I think oftentimes credit unions are merging. This might not be true in every case, but oftentimes they're in a sense forced to merge in the sense of competing in the marketplace. Just like the big banks are merging. It might seem weird that a huge corporation feels forced to merge, but they also feel merged in order to compete against the bigger banks. And I think credit unions are in a similar situation. And I think whether it's a credit union or a mainstream financial institution or a small mom and pop store, you shouldn't assume that just by being whatever a credit union, that they are necessarily giving the best, lowest costing products. Though I think as a whole it still is true that credit unions have more of a low to moderate income focused and are focused on developing products aimed at those communities that are helpful. But clearly, there must be comparisons and examinations. And, I would say the NAACP Economic Department has talked more and more about engaging credit unions, but we have started off focusing on the big 5 banking institutions because obviously that is hitting most of America, the largest percent of America. But more work does need to be done on coordinating and organizing around credit unions.
Great. And another question for you, Dietrich. What has been the feedback from banks and policymakers on your report?
Policymakers actually I'm starting to have more conversations with them next week. With banks, banks, no one's happy when they get a low grade in a certain area, and they're happier when they're getting a higher grade. I think what's going to be the most important discussions is over the next couple years is, okay, here's where we graded you. Now, how can we move forward? I think it's easiest to help banks move forward when we can show that one of the leading 5 banks is doing well in an area where they're doing poorly. The hardest is when all of the banks are doing poorly in a particular area and how to point to them to move forward. I think the most positive thing about the response is that all of the banks are still willing to engage us and have regular conversations about these issues. So I think that's the most important thing.
Great. Let me see. This one I'll give over to Melanie. Are all the apps and games mentioned free and are most appropriate for children?
Yeah, so everything that I mentioned is all free on our website and in the App Store. They are aimed at adults for the most part, but they're not inappropriate for children.
Great, thank you. This question came in. Do we know which banks are in ownership of the payday lending companies?
Hi, this is Marissa Bell. Yes, I actually just had a report come across my desk that one of my colleagues at another organization had worked on. So if whoever asked the question can send me an email, I can make sure to get that information out to you. And they have basically a chart that shows sort of who has the largest share in some of those fringe financial service products.
Yeah, I'll just add, most banks are smart enough not to have a direct ownership. They have investments, and even any more and more major banks are starting to pull away from that because it puts them in such negative light. But just usually it's not a direct ownership, it's some type of investment.
And
Thank you.
I'll add that some banks actually did have advance pay or advance deposit products that a number of them have taken off as a service that they offer. A lot of the mainstream ones had products that basically were a mainstream payday lender, pretty much coming directly from the bank, and a lot of them have stopped that as a direct result of the regulatory pressure that they've been facing. OCC came out with some regulations against that, and so we know that a number of banks have taken those products completely off of their offerings.
Great, thank you. This question I'll go ahead and I'll address to the larger group. When it comes to rebuilding household wealth for low-income and minority Americans, what sorts of goals should regulators overseeing financial institutions adopt in order to increase the supply of credit?
Let me just throw out there, I'll let someone really the substance of the question, but I mean, oftentimes it's not an issue of rebuilding wealth for low-income, moderate income. I mean, before the financial crisis, African Americans, Latinos still generally had, about a tenth of the wealth of whites, and so you're talking about, and that's middle income. That's like $5,000 or something like that, $10,000. So, but particularly for lower income people, it's building wealth for the first time. But I'll let someone else answer the question directly.
So this actually is being debated right now. We're going through GSE, the GSEs, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. Sort of the future of them they're now in conservatorship, is being debated right now. So this is something that Congress is looking over. They have had a number of proposals that have come over the past 3 or 4 years, I'd say. And so this is something that people are really trying to influence right now. And I know the NCLR, as well as a number of different national civil rights focused organizations really have all tried to help craft these proposals and help let legislators know exactly what the impact of the different proposals will mean. So I would encourage you to again, you can contact me directly and I can help put you into some of those conversations. I know that we're going to actually have a convening in April in Washington, D.C., specifically around housing finance reform. So if you're interested in that,
This is Dietrich again. Let me also put forward, and we see at the NAACP still see homeownership as a fundamental step in asset and wealth development, particularly for moderate income people. Of course, it needs to be sustainable homeownership and not subprime loans, which people will default on because the loans are structured in a bad way. But we need sustainable homeownership, and actually an increased sustainable homeownership, unlike what we had in the 2000s where we're having unsustainable massive mortgage lending.
And that leads us to our final question, actually. People of color have lost over 50% of equity in their homes because of the financial crisis. How do we, I'm not sure this person is a practitioner or an advocate, but how do we assist them with the rebuild?
Well, I'll say, there's nothing you can do individually to increase the increase the appreciation of your home. If you are a homeowner, I think there is a general belief, and there's some evidence, though it's back and forth, that prices of homes are going up generally across the country. There's some particular areas where that is not the case. I think the issue, if you're already a homeowner, then is to how to further solidify your finances. And if you're already a homeowner, is there ways to start diversifying your investments? You ideally don't want to have all of your assets just in homeownership. The only problem is that for too many Americans, you can only afford to invest seriously in one asset, and that usually is your home. But if you're already a homeowner, you have a mortgage you can afford, and you still have some extra income, starting to diversify that is very important.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Well, I think this has been a very productive and enlightening webinar around these issues. If you have any further questions for our presenters, Marissa Bell from NCLR, Dietrich Muhammad from NDoubleACP, or Melanie Kwan from D2D Fund, please follow up with them individually, or you may contact me and I may refer them to each individual panelist. But I just want to say thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.